Your cousin announces that she got into medical school. In a Western family, great, that's her achievement. In her moment, everyone celebrates her. In an Asian family, however, this becomes the new baseline. Your parents may not have been trying to make you feel bad. They might not have, turned to you and say that, oh, look at your sister, she did better. And what about you? Maybe there's an implicit expectation now that that bar has been raised. The question is, well, what's your plan now? How are you going to match this? A group of researchers gave a test to North American students and Asian students. And during this time, they told them completely false feedback. They told them that one group of all the North Americans and one group of all the Asians, basically that they had succeeded and the other half had failed. And then they gave a new, more challenging task and secretly measured how long it would take for them to continue to persist to try to solve it. And the results were actually almost opposites. As in, North Americans tried significantly harder and longer after receiving positive feedback when they told them that, oh, you succeeded after the first test. Success actually boosted their confidence and made them want to keep going. The Japanese group, however, showed the opposite pattern. They persisted significantly longer and tried harder when they received failure feedback. As in, the more that they struggled, the more that they actually tried to improve. Again, this is the same test, same people, but completely opposite psychological wiring. North Americans were motivated by the feeling of winning, while the Japanese were motivated by the information of losing. And this isn't just a lab finding, by the way. You know that feeling you get when maybe your cousin gets into a top university and suddenly your college admissions suddenly feels like more of a failure? Or when your coworker gets promoted or gets, some kind of like extra credit and you start to question everything that you've done wrong? So realize that this actually is exactly what your brain is trained to do. And if you grew up in an Asian household, comparison isn't just a bad habit you picked up. It's how you learn to measure your worth. So here's the thing. Is this about tiger parenting or about strict cultural expectations? No, it's actually deeper than this. Your culture literally wires your brain to define success as defined through other people's achievements. And as we dive into this video, we're going to take a look at why it is that our motivational systems oftentimes actually can work against us, even if it seems to work for everyone else. So let's start with the framework that explains the basis behind this. There are two fundamentally different ways that all human beings construct self-worth. And it's how it is that we map who we are. And the really interesting thing is that if you take a look at the two main frameworks, they actually map directly onto Western versus Asian cultures. In Western cultures like North America and Europe, people operate based on what psychologists call the independent model of self. In other words, your worth comes from your own internal attributes, your talent, your personality, your unique qualities. And because it's our individualistic cultures, your goal is to stand out, to be different, to express yourself, right? In North America, oftentimes we talk about the idea of, personal development, how it is that you show up. And this is called agency. Agency means when you're acting independently of other people. You're supposed to be authentic, chase your dreams, celebrate what makes you special. But in East Asian cultures, people operate with what's called an interdependent model of self. In other words, your worth comes from your relationships, your role fulfillment, and how well you fit into a group. The goal isn't to stand out. It's actually to fit in better, to meet expectations, and to maintain harmony. These are core cultural values that if you're from an Asian background, you probably already understand. So, for example, like how you function or succeed oftentimes is a reflection of how your family is viewed. When we talk about things like face, when we talk about things like cultural, harmony, or we talk about even the idea of like, what will other people think if they found out that my child did this, is how would that reflect to me? In a Western family, that might not be as big of a deal because oftentimes there's an individualistic idea. A child, when they hit, their early adulthood, are expected to move out and start their own family. But agency also means adjusting to others, not just asserting yourself over them. You're supposed to honor your family, especially in Asian cultures, meet social obligations, and oftentimes you're measured by your ability to contribute to the collective good. Hence, Asian cultures are often called collectivist. And here's why this matters. This isn't just about different philosophies in life. They're entirely different psychological operating systems. And your cultural background shapes what makes you feel valuable as a person at the most basic level. So a Western kid celebrates being told that they're unique and creative and are told to pursue their passions and, find your purpose. Whereas an Asian kid might have grown up being celebrated when they make their parents proud and hearing that they've honored the family, their achievements are a reflection of their family pride. And as a result, no matter who you are and whether or not you grew up with strict family expectations or not, that cultural background oftentimes defines a different source of your self-worth. This is what the researchers call mutual constitution, as in the culture needs you to think this way to function properly. Asian cultures need people who prioritize group harmony and role fulfillment, or the whole system breaks down. This is especially common with Confucian cultures that are, based on things like Japan, Korea, China, Taiwan, Singapore, etc. You need your entire culture's approval and support in order for you to feel whole in these cultures. Your individualistic desires are oftentimes seen as less important. And it's not one-sided conditioning. It's a two-way street where culture and self create each other. So think about how this plays out in real life. A Western student gets into college. The celebration is about their personal achievement, their hard work, their bright future. Whereas when an Asian student gets into college, the celebration oftentimes is about the family's success. It's about the parents' sacrifice paying off, the continuation of upward mobility across generations. One event, two completely different meanings. Now, this doesn't just affect how you feel good about yourself. It might change how you react to success and failure in fundamental ways. So in Western cultures, success is seen as something that should boost your self-esteem because it confirms your internal qualities. Right, this is something you're good at. You're smart, you're talented, you're capable. Failure, on the other hand, is a reflection of your self-worth because it suggests that those internal qualities aren't as strong as you thought. So people learn to protect themselves. They downplay failure. They make excuses. They compare themselves to people doing worse to feel better. In East Asian cultures, on the other hand, success creates pressure. Because the more you succeed, the bar becomes higher, and now you have to maintain it. Failure creates motivation because it shows that where you need to improve to meet the group's standards and expectations. So you don't protect yourself from failure. You actually use it as information about what you need to stand on and what you need to fix. So the research actually shows this really clearly. Japanese participants readily accepted feedback on what they performed worse than average. And in the same group of North Americans, they looked at specifically Canadian participants, they found that they actually rejected the same feedback. As in, when they were given negative feedback, they were most likely to discount it. Now, this isn't about them lying to themselves. It's just what it is our brains prioritize. Do we tend to look for what is positive or what is negative first when we're looking at who we are? And this, by the way, has a lot to do with different cultures, especially during the fact that during the 70s, the 80s, there was a lot of focus in Western communities on essentially the self-esteem movement, right? Are we good enough? Are we teaching our kids to feel good about themselves? But it's also what failure means for your sense of self-worth. So here's where it gets really interesting. Western psychology spends decades documenting what they call the self-enhancement bias. So basically, people in Western cultures consistently, in these cases, overestimate their abilities. They think they're better than average at pretty much everything. Now, I'm not saying this as a dig at Westerners or anything like that. I think to a certain degree, all of us probably think we're better. I mean, I think there's studies that show that if you ask the average driver whether they think that they are better drivers or worse drivers, most will think that they are better drivers than average. And of course, that doesn't make sense. How can most people be better than average? By definition, average is most people. But this is where it is that's really interesting because culture, again, plays that role. So in Western cultures, individuals, typically speaking, are seen as taking credit for successes, as in, hey, you worked really hard for this. Congrats, you did this. And again, they hold unrealistically optimistic views about their future. It's the default setting. Hey, I just wanted to let you know that Big Asian Energy is officially out, and you can go and pick it up anywhere you buy books, Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, etc. If you've ever felt like there's something stopping you from reaching your full potential, if you've ever felt like you want to have that unstoppable charisma and confidence in the work that you do, as well as just the way you show up in life, this might be the book for you. It is a book that is jam-packed with research studies, advice, case studies, stories, and of course, so many different techniques and takeaways, including communication, as well as mindset, as well as confidence, and all the other topics out there. It just won one of the best books of 2025 on Amazon. So if you haven't checked it out yet, go take a look. And finally, if you have a few seconds, can I also ask you to leave a quick review for Big Asian Energy? It not only means the world to us to hear from you, but more importantly, it does absolutely help us in reaching more audiences. I hope you're having an amazing day, and thanks again. So for a long time, psychologists, because psychology was more developed in the West during this time, they just thought that this is how all humans work. So in the previous test we talked about in the beginning, this was the study they were talking about. Hein and Lehman are two psychologists who, in a landmark study in 2000s, basically compared Japanese and Canadian participants completing what they thought was an intelligence test. And the result was that 29% of Canadians made calculations that basically made them conclude that they did better than everyone else, whereas only 19% of that Western group made the errors in the opposite direction. On the other hand, the Japanese participants concluded that they did worse than average or more confident. As in, they just naturally assumed that they're worse than they really are. The pattern held for how long they spent reviewing the data. Canadians who had accepted they did poorly spent significantly more time staring at the feedback, apparently in disbelief, because they couldn't believe that they did poorer than average. Whereas the Japanese participants who had to accept that they did well viewed more trials before deciding and were reluctant to conclude that they outperformed their peers. Again, same objective feedback, but when it comes to Japanese students, they were more likely to believe that they're supposed to do poor compared to average compared to the Canadians. Same objective feedback, same objective test, completely opposite responses. So this brings up the question, is it that Asians have low self-esteem or lack confidence? Well, neither. It's actually true. They're operating within a completely different motive. When we actually take a look at how Western individualistic cultures work, it's that self-enhancement is prioritized. You're taught that, you should self-promote. You should show off the best part of yourself. Whereas East Asian cultures prioritize humility, sometimes to an extreme. And the idea of any time that you're talking about the things that you're good at is sometimes seen as just, not just cringy, but outright problematic. Because when you're focusing on the individual strengths, you end up not meeting the group strengths. And this shows up in how people respond to success versus failure. So in Western cultures, people try harder after they succeed. Makes sense. Success feels good. It boosts your confidence. It makes you want to keep going. Failure, on the other hand, is demotivating because it threatens your sense of competence. So people will often give up or switch tasks after failing. Makes sense, right? But in East Asian cultures, it was the opposite. So in the 2001 study by Hein and colleagues, they tested this directly. They gave participants success or failure feedback on a creativity task, and they measured how long they persisted on a follow-up task. This culture is so deeply ingrained that we're not just talking about individuals. What they found was that even role models that motivate people were different. As in, Western cultures loved success stories. They loved stories of people who made it, who achieved greatness, who proved what's possible. Now, this makes sense. These stories are inspiring because they show you what you could become. But what they also found was in East Asian cultures, people were more likely motivated by negative role models, people who failed, who struggled, who show you what to avoid, and more importantly, the sacrifices that came from it. It wasn't about pessimism, but about learning from the mistakes and understanding the consequences of others. So think about how this might play out at a family dinner. Your cousin announces that she got into medical school. In a Western family, great, that's her achievement. In her moment, everyone celebrates her. In an Asian family, however, this becomes the new baseline. Now, everyone is immediately thinking, oh gosh, wow, okay, well, she got into medical school. Where do I measure up? Because now the standard has been raised. Your parents may not have been trying to make you feel bad. They might not have, turned to you and say that, oh, look at your sister, she did better. Now, what about you? But maybe there's an implicit expectation now that that bar has been raised. The question is, well, what's your plan now? How are you going to match this? So again, imagine a Western family. Each individual person is seen more of going on their own path. There are definitely black sheeps and, everything like that in every family, but the expectation and pressures by the culture in a collectivist culture is going to be higher. So in that Asian model of the world, your cousin's success raises the bar for the whole family standing because after all, they just brought honor and pride to the whole family. And that means that anyone who is not up to that level becomes a little bit of a drag. And this is why perfectionism in Asian cultures isn't just a personality thing. It's oftentimes a survival strategy. Because if your self-worth depends on you maintaining your position in the group, and the group standard keeps raising based on everyone's expectations and achievements, then that constant improvement isn't optional. It's how you avoid falling behind. It's how you maintain your value. It might even be the sense of like, oh my gosh, my parents work so hard, they're so successful, and I'm not. Am I letting them down? Am I failing them just because I didn't achieve the same degree of success that they did? It's how you maintain your contribution to the family goal. And now, this drive towards constant improvement is powered by a very specific psychological mechanism that Western cultures use completely differently, specifically that of social comparison. So what is social comparison? Social comparison is where everyone comes together. Humans are naturally always evaluating yourselves against other people. That's not cultural. That's just everyone. We're always comparing ourselves to other people to figure out where we stand. So in case you're a Western person watching this and you're going, wait a second, that's not true. When, my friend, had a success, I also feel bad about myself. That's fine. That's normal. That's all of us. But when there's no objective measure of whether you're doing well, you might look around and start comparing. Am I generous? Well, compared to whom? Am I creative? Well, it depends on who you're measuring against. Social comparison is the tool that we universally use to answer these questions. So here's where culture actually change how this tool works. In Western cultures, people generally use comparison strategically to protect their self-esteem. So in other words, they're more likely to engage in downward comparison. They're more likely to look at people who are doing worse to feel better about themselves. Well, sure, I'm not hitting that mark yet, but at least I'm not as bad as that person. And when they do compare upward to people doing better, it's usually a little bit more selective and inspirational. As in, hey, my friend said that they did this, and that shows me what's possible if I work really hard. And the moment that upward comparison starts threatening their self-worth, they oftentimes stop, they disengage, and they find a different reference point. In East Asian cultures, comparison are used in opposite ways. Upward comparison isn't threatening, it's informational. It's about protecting your ego. It's about knowing where you stand in the group and what you need to do to maintain your position. You don't get to choose when to stop comparing because the comparison is usually constant. As in collectivist cultures, there's a lot more of it that just seems to take place. When researchers show East Asian participants someone performing better than them on a task, they're more likely to persist longer on the same task and try harder because they see that superior performance as a guide to what is expected of them. And when researchers show Western participants the same thing, they actually end up giving up faster. So they see superior performance that maybe this isn't for them. The same information, but opposite responses. And this is often why it is that Asian families have what feels like a secret ranking system. And it's not just siblings, it's cousins, families, friends, kids, people your parents met once at a wedding. Everyone becomes a data point in the constant evaluation of where your family stands. And this is really important to keep in mind, is that your mom isn't being cruel when she mentions that your cousin's daughter's best friend got a full scholarship. She's just updating the reference point, and she's just showing you where that updated current standard is. And this is why it is that when researchers, White and Lehman in 2005, they found that Asian Canadians who receive failure feedback on a test actually preferred to look at the test of someone who did better than they did. Automatically, they sought out upward comparison. Whereas, by comparison, European Canadians showed no such preference. They didn't want to look at superior performance after failing. They felt like that was going to drag them down or make them feel worse. For East Asians, upward comparison isn't threatening, it's informational. It shows, okay, this is what's possible, and this is what I need to aim for next. And this extends way beyond family. So if you take a look at how schools work in Asia versus the West, this is a lot more apparent. In many Asian countries, class rankings are public. Like these tests that everyone does oftentimes starts at a young age. Everyone knows exactly where they stand in relativity to everyone else. Students know their rank, parents know their rank, teachers organize seating sometimes, in extreme cases, by their rank. And it's not considered cruel. It's just, again, is informational. How else would you know where you need to improve? In Western schools, this will be considered psychologically devastating. Everyone is special. Everyone's on their journey, and comparing students is harmful to their self-esteem. This isn't as big of a priority in most Asian countries. And when you actually go to the workplace, it shows the same patterns. Asian companies often have very clear hierarchies and promotional systems based on seniority and meritocracy performance metrics. That way, everyone knows where they stand. Now, Western companies, on the other hand, have actually seen the opposite. Many of them are increasingly trying to flatten hierarchies and de-emphasize, the different positions that everyone holds over others. They want to create more fairness and equality and emphasize individual contribution over rank. Same goals of productivity, but completely different systems. And if you ever go to countries like, Japan or Korea or China, you start to see that in many of their company cultures. And here's where the double bind that Asian culture started creating is that comparison becomes basically the source of your stress and the engine of your motivation. Because after all, you can't opt out of it without opting out of the entire system of how worth is determined. And because your self-worth is tied to your standing in the group, opting out really isn't an option. You're kind of stuck in a system where you're always looking up. You're always measuring up yourself against the next benchmark, and you're always aware of how you stack up. But comparison doesn't just happen between individuals. It extends to entire groups, and that's where the pressure gets even more intense. We've talked about how individuals compare themselves to other individuals. But in Asian, again, collectivist cultures, there's studies that show another layer that makes everything more complicated. In collectivist cultures, you're not just comparing yourselves to your peers. You're actually comparing yourselves to your entire group of other groups. Like, as in, you're not just comparing yourself to your immediate family, your immediate friends, but oftentimes other families, schools, workplaces across sometimes entire countries. And this is the difference between where interpersonal and intergroup comparison come to use. In Western cultures, comparison is mostly interpersonal. You compare your skill to your coworker's skills, your achievement to your friend's achievements. It's about individual standing because, again, this is an individualistic society. But in East Asian cultures, intergroup comparisons carry just as much weight. As in, your cousin gets into an Ivy League school, that's not just a personal achievement, that's their family's achievement, and it's your extended family's achievement. It raises your family standing relative to other families in your community. It's not just, hey, did you hear so-and-so got in? It's, did you hear so-and-so's family? Right? So suddenly everyone in the family feels pressure to maintain that new standard. And that's why pride and shame function as collective emotions in Asian cultures. There's that idea of like you bring shame upon the family, not just yourself. Because when your siblings succeed, you might feel genuine pride, even if you didn't do anything. Because their success reflects well on your family unit. And when your siblings fail, you might feel genuine shame, not because it was their failure, but it's also in some way your family's failure, right? Your cousin's Ivy League admissions become something you're proud of, and at the same time, your sibling's divorce becomes something that you're quietly ashamed of and might even affect your own family standing. It sometimes even affects things like whether, you're dating or marriage prospects. Does the fact that someone in your family have a mental health struggle reflect something about you because you're part of the same group? So this intensifies the pressures in other ways that are hard to overstate. Because you're not just responsible now for your own outcomes. You're responsible for maintaining the entire family standing. Every choice you make, every failure, every accomplishment reflects on people beyond yourself. So you can't just pursue your own passions without considering how they affect your family's reputation. You can't just fail quietly on your own. Your failures becomes everyone's concern. And this brings me to the third scientific study. So this study was by Ko and Kim, who basically studied this by comparing friend dyads. And basically what that means is that Asian Americans participants saw their implicit self-esteem drop when they saw that a close friend had succeeded on task. In other words, their friend's success made them feel worse about themselves. European American participants showed the exact opposite pattern. They felt worse when their friend failed. But when the researchers shifted the comparison from interpersonal to intergroup, making it about team performance rather than individual performance, that's when the pattern flips. Asian Americans reported lower self-esteem when their team failed, even though their individual score was higher than their partners. Comparatively speaking, European American self-esteem wasn't affected by team outcomes in the same way. The unit of comparison completely changed how success and failure affects self-worth. You can take a look at this in immigrant family dynamics, where this becomes perhaps even more intense. Your family sacrificed everything to give you opportunities. They left their countries, they gave up on their careers, their support systems, worked jobs below their education levels. They lived in smaller homes, they saved every dollar they could, and all of that sacrifice was an investment in the family's future standing. Because when one person in the family fails, it is not just their own individual setback, it feels like that sacrifice went to waste. The collective investment didn't pay off. And that's why pressures in immigrant families can feel absolutely crushing, because it's not just about you. It's about justifying your parents' sacrifice. And then therefore, your sacrifice is the only way to repay it. But here's what people outside of these cultures often miss, is that this system actually has real benefits. Because it means that you're never alone in your struggles. When you're succeeding, you have a whole network who's supposed to celebrate with you. And when you face challenges, you have a built-in support of a shared responsibility. The same system that creates pressure also creates belonging. You matter to people beyond yourself. Your outcomes affect others, which means that others are invested in helping you succeed. It's also why it is that in Asian families, you see more people kind of rallying together. There's a sense of like, oh, we're all in the same in-group. We're all our own people. As a matter of fact, when I was growing up, there was a Chinese term, I was born in Taipei, and there's a term basically that just means our people. And our people are those within our in-group. And in our people, you're not as polite because you want to be more direct. And there's an expectation that the entire family will drop everything that they need to come support you. That sense of weight and impression is so significant that sometimes it goes across entire cities or even countries. Like, for example, looking at China, during their once-a-year national test, which is this big test called Gaokao, literally everyone gathers together. Like, the government comes out and shuts down traffic around schools so that it will quiet the area and not disturb kids. Local hotels offer free rooms to students who are there to take the test. Restaurants actually discount their food so that children have enough to eat. It becomes this thing where everyone comes in and gathers to support each other. The cost, though, is that then you can't support and separate your own worth from others' outcomes. You can't just be happy for your cousin without immediately wondering what their success means for your standing. And you can't just focus on your own path without constantly checking where everyone is. Your identity is fundamentally relational, which means that you're always aware of the web of comparisons and expectations that surround you. So what happens when you inevitably fail? When your self-worth is tied to both individual performance and group standing and you fall short, how do you cope when comparison itself is the source of the threat? So here's where Western mental health advice often fail Asian people. When you're stressed and struggling, what's the standard advice? Oh, you should open up and talk about it. Share your feelings. Seek support from your friends and families, right? Express your emotions. Get it off your chest. This is the foundation of Western therapy, especially Western talk therapy, right? You just got to open up and share what you're going through. And in the West, this research backs it up. For Western people, explicit social support seeking absolutely works. When Americans talk about their problems and get advice and reassurance from others, their stress is measurably going down. They feel better. The support is effective. But when researchers tested this in East Asian populations, they found interesting things. They found that explicit support seeking didn't just fail to help, it sometimes made things worse. When East Asian participants who were encouraged to talk about their problems and seek direct support from others, they repeated increased stress, not decreased stress. And the very thing that they were supposed to help ended up backfiring. And this isn't because we're wired differently or that Western psychology doesn't work on Eastern people, but it has to do with the way the culture works. Because after all, in an Eastern and collectivist culture, when you explicitly seek support, you're doing several things that already violate cultural norms. First, you feel like you're burdening others with your problems. You're making your struggles, which are supposed to be carried by yourself, their concern, which creates a sense of obligation and disrupts the smooth functioning of relationships. Second, you're disrupting what is expected of social harmony by introducing negative emotions and conflicts into social space. Third, you're highlighting your own needs over the group's needs, which often feels selfish. Four, you're creating a situation where others now have relational obligations to help you because now they can't not because you asked for it. And it adds guilt on top of your original problem. So as a result, talking about problems doesn't just relieve stress. It actually creates new stress, and especially about how you disclose that information and the obligations that you're creating. You're not just dealing with your original problem anymore. Now you're also managing everyone else's reactions, worrying about being a burden, feeling guilty about disrupting harmony, and keeping track of new social debts that you've created. This support itself becomes another source of anxiety. So here's what you need to remember. Comparison isn't the enemy, but depending on who you are and what culture you're from, the culture, which isn't damaging or toxic just implicitly, can be very different. And the way you motivate yourself really might be affected by it. At the end of the day, you have to take a look at what your own individual values are so you can determine what it is that is important to you. How do you want to seek support? How do you want to self-motivate? What works for you? Motivation at its core is just a feeling. So finding out what your own motivational code is really, really important. Now, if you're interested in diving into this deeper and finding out more specifically to your own style, I have a quiz which talks about the 7 most common patterns that show up in Asian Americans, specifically the ways that we show up as achievers, fixers, chameleons, etc. If you want to find out more, you can go and check it out on my website, bigasianenergy.com, or check out my book, Big Asian Energy, where we dive in and talk more about how do we use the psychology of our culture to improve who we are and get what it is that we really want. Until then, talk soon.